Welcome back to the That You May Know Him podcast, illuminating biblical truth, applying it to faith, life, and culture so that you can know and love Jesus Christ like never before. I'm your host, Blake Barbera, excited to be back for another edition of the show. This is episode 184 of That You May Know Him, and we have been moving our way through the book of Revelation for a while now, and we are finally approaching the end. What we're covering today in this episode is Revelation chapters 17 and 18. And these events that we're going to talk about are literally the last events, the last recorded events that will take place on the earth before the epic finale of this book. And what does the epic finale of this book contain? The return of Jesus Christ. Chapter 19 is where we see the rider on the white horse appear out of heaven. And so we're not talking about that today. We're talking about the things that happened just before that. And we're also specifically going to be answering one very important question, which is this: who is the great prostitute in the book of Revelation? Lots of people like to talk about this great prostitute and Mystery Babylon. Both of those characters, if I'm able to say both of those characters, are found in Revelation chapter 17. So for the first part of this episode, we're going to be talking about the great prostitute, Mystery Babylon, the identity of these symbols. And then for the second part of this episode, we're going to talk about specifically the timeline of events, chapters 17 and 18, which lead up to the return of our great King. So, my friends, here we go. This is Revelation chapters 17 and 18. Our episode today, Fallen is Babylon the Great. That's actually one of the verses that we'll read in this episode. These events that we're going to look at are really when the tables continue to turn more and more. When we looked at chapters 15 and 16, I said the tables really turn in these chapters, or start to turn, up until chapter 15 and 16. It seems like things on the earth are going very bad for the church, for the people of God, for the body of Christ. When you get to chapter 15, it's when things start to shift. And then when you get here to chapter 17, it's when things really shift. This is when Babylon the Great falls for good. So that's what we're looking at today. I'll get our passage up on the screen. Here's Revelation 17. And let's get into it. Who is the great prostitute? I'm going to read the first part of this chapter for our viewers and listeners here in a minute. But the question that we're really after in the first part of this episode is, who is the great prostitute in the book of Revelation? You might have heard about this character. You might have read Revelation on your own before and wondered who this character is. I find that this character gets a lot of attention, although not many people, from my experience, are really willing to do the work of diving into the text and seeing all of the attributes that are mentioned in light of this symbol, that are given, or that are attributed, attributes that are attributed to the great prostitute. That's what we're looking at today. It's important to remember that John, all through the book, but especially here when he's talking about this specific symbol, the great prostitute, uses a number of analogies to describe a single subject. He does this often. The analogies are not necessarily meant to work perfectly together. They're meant to give you various viewpoints, various perspectives of a single subject. In the case of the prostitute, like I said, he really drives this home. However, there's a ton of things that we're going to look at quickly, like list some of the characteristics that he mentions about her. If you try and fit them all together, you might run into trouble. They're not necessarily meant to go together. They're all various viewpoints of the symbol being the great prostitute. It's sort of like how the Gospels work. The Gospels are meant to be read synoptically. They're 4 eyewitness perspectives of the life of Christ. All of them are true and historically reliable. If you try and line them up and say, well, this has to be exactly what happened over in this account, It's not going to work that way. It doesn't work that way. If you were in a court of law and a prosecutor brought 4 witnesses up and interviewed each one of them on the stand individually, their testimonies would not line up perfectly. In other words, they would not be saying the same words, maybe this exact same series of events in the same exact order. You would have 4 different perspectives from eyewitnesses on one account. That's what you have in the Gospels. That's what you have with these analogies of the great prostitute. They're all meant to inform us, but we don't need to necessarily try and make them all fit into one single thing, sort of like Tetris or something like that. Okay, so let me read you Revelation 17, verses 1 through 6. And this is the first bit of description that we're given as it relates to this great prostitute. Now remember, we've already had several instances in this book where John is taking us along in a series of events, and then all of a sudden there's like a scene shift, right? Chapter 12 is definitely a scene shift, right? We're looking at all these plagues and judgments and all this stuff being unleashed on the world, and then all of a sudden John says, and suddenly I saw a great sign in heaven. He's being shown a different scene now, right? This is sort of like that. All of a sudden, it seems like there's a scene shift. And you'll see what I mean when I read this first verse. Revelation chapter 17, starting in verse 1. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality. And with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk." And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names. And it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery. A name of mystery. The name of mystery is this: Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw a woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Okay, I said this once already, but let me just remind you one more time before we get into these attributes. Like the dragon in chapter 12, like the woman and the child in chapter 12, like the beast in chapter 13, like the riders on the horses, all the way back in chapter 6, I think it is. This is a symbol. What's being described here with the great prostitute is a symbol. She represents something. First thing you need to know about the prostitute, whatever John is referring to, whatever this symbol represents, he describes it as a prostitute. I don't need to spell out what that means, but it is good to sit down and maybe think about what are some of the attributes of prostitutes. What do prostitutes do? They sell themselves, right? They sell themselves. They sell their honor in order to acquire riches and money. They sell their morality. In some sense, they sell their souls. Now, look, hear me out. There's a ton of sex trafficking that's going on in the world today. And I know that a lot of women who are caught up in that are not there of their own volition. But what's being described here, is not a woman who's been sold into sex slavery. This is a prostitute, a woman who has willfully decided to become a great harlot, to sell her body for riches and for wealth. She's seated next on many waters. The angel himself interprets this phrase. The angel who's showing John this picture will interpret this phrase later on in the chapter in verse 15. I'm not going to take you there now. Well, actually, you know what? I could just scroll down here quickly and let you see the verse for yourself. If you're watching us on YouTube or Rumble, And the angel said to me, Revelation 17:15, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. Huh. Interesting, isn't it? The waters that the prostitute is seated on are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. In other words, the woman is seated upon the nations. She's seated upon the peoples of the earth. Her reach and her influence is widespread, and it encompasses most or many of the peoples of the earth, peoples from all of the multitudes and nations and languages. It says that the kings of the earth in Revelation 17:2 have committed sexual immorality with her, and the dwellers on earth have become drunk with the wine of her sexual immorality. I think for sure that this is referring literally to sexual immorality. But I also think that sexual immorality in this chapter specifically is an indicator or a sign or a sort of reference to immorality of all kinds. If you look throughout biblical history and throughout church history and throughout world history, sexual immorality always leads to other sorts of immorality. It always does. There's no question about it. Once you start getting lax on the standards of what a biblical, God-ordained, God-blessed sexual immorality is, sexual morality or morale is, once you lose that, everything else starts to go along with it. Next, it says in 17:14 that the woman, this great harlot, is clothed in very costly clothing, purple and scarlet, gold and jewels and pearls. She literally, in every sense of the word, represents luxurious living, plain and simple. She represents immorality, lack of values, but very, very luxurious living. What's she done? She has replaced her values, her honor, her morality, her soul, in a sense, with luxury, with riches, with wealth, maybe with worldly honor, although when we're talking about a prostitute, I don't know how often they're actually considered honorable by the world or by people. It says next, few more, she is drunk with the blood of the saints and of the martyrs of Jesus. So she is a persecutor of the people of God. She's after them, she kills them, and she gets drunk with their blood. There's actually an element of cannibalism in this picture that we're being given by John, which is pretty intense if you think about it. She's seated on a scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. Interesting. If you were with us when we covered chapter 13, this should remind you of the beast from chapter 13 because it's the exact same beast. How do we know that? Well, the way it looks, it has 7 heads and 10 horns like that beast, but also there's common language that's used to connect this beast to that beast. We're told in this chapter that in order to understand who the beast is, it says this calls for wisdom or for a mind with wisdom. That was the exact thing that we were told back in chapter 13 about discerning the number of the beast. Remember, I told you that the beast in chapter 13, in a sense, represents the Roman Empire, but more specifically, it represents the leader of that empire. Specifically in chapter 13, I think that John, for the people who first heard his letter, who first received it and read it, they automatically would have been thinking of Nero, of the Emperor Nero, who was alive likely before this was written, but was very much still in and on the minds of Christians living in Asia Minor who had been persecuted. Their friends and family had been persecuted by Nero. But it doesn't just represent Nero. It also represents a secular power, an individual who comes to power, who puts himself in place of God. That's who the beast represents. This woman, this great harlot in chapter 17 is seated on the beast. Isn't that amazing? The beast is literally propping her up. 2 more real quick. The name on her head reads Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. if you've ever heard about the phrase, if you've ever heard of the phrase Mystery Babylon, people talk about this all the time. If you Google it, go search on YouTube, or just talk to people who are into prophecy, people are always talking about Mystery Babylon, Mystery Babylon. Which country is going to be Mystery Babylon? It comes from this chapter in this verse right here, chapter 17. Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of the earth's abominations. That's Revelation 17:5. It's very simple. Babylon the Great, Mystery Babylon, is the great prostitute. They're synonymous with one another. They're not separate from each other. I've heard people say that in Revelation 17, you have Mystery Babylon and the great prostitute, like talking about both of them. They're not two different symbols. They're actually one symbol. John is letting us know by saying that this great prostitute, her name is Babylon the Great. He's letting us know who she is supposed to represent, who she symbolizes. Last thing, last attribute we're going to list, and then I'll tell you who I think the great prostitute is intended to represent. The 7 heads of the beast she is riding on are also 7 kings and 7 mountains. This reference is surely an allusion to the Roman Empire, whose capital city, Rome, was called the city built on 7 hills. The number 7, I think, can be taken literally in a lot of these instances in the book of Revelation. When it talks about 7 mountains, Rome was built on 7 hills. Some Christians have taken that and made this doctrine, this sort of last days or current, more modern thing called the 7 mountain mandate. And they make it about the 7 mountains of culture. And the church needs to take back the 7 mountains of culture. It's interesting. In the book of Revelation, any talk of 7 mountains or 7 hills is always connected to Rome. Rome being the beast. I'm sorry, Rome being, partly the beast. I think evil emperors and antichrists are actually more specifically the beast, but they're propped up by the empire that they represent. And they also prop up the empires that they rule and that they work for. So when you when you hear a Christian talking about 7 mountains of influence and culture, like maybe there's a lot of misunderstanding around that. It's just interesting that Christians have come to believe that it's our job to transform the world and more or less advance the gospel exclusively through taking over cultures and nations and kingdoms, as opposed to the way it was being done in the first century, which is we are completely counterculture. We are a set apart, sanctified, holy nation unto God. And those are 2 completely different things. My friend Rich and I covered this pretty thoroughly in a series we did last year and this year called God Save America ? And in one of those episodes, we talk about the 7 mountain mandate and all these, how sort of, Christianity and being a Christian in America or in the world today, how we view our relationship to culture and the nations that we live in. You can check that series out. A lot of those episodes are on YouTube, but also the entire series you can listen to on our website or on any podcasting app. Okay, guys, real quick, I'm going to pause for just a second so I can tell you about the That You May Know Him blog. It's called Coffee with God. This is where we publish new devotions every week. We publish Bible studies often. We're a little behind on our Revelation Bible studies, but soon, definitely when we finish up this series on Revelation, which we're doing this month, we will have Bible studies on our blog that cover every single chapter of the book of Revelation. So we're always publishing new content. We're always publishing new Bible studies, new articles that answer your questions about the Bible. And of course, devotions are up there every week. A lot of those have videos that go with them. It's really a lot of work's going into it, and the readership's going up a lot. So I just wanted to take a second and let you, our viewers and listeners, know about the That You May Know Him blog, Coffee with God. Our goal, our vision for the blog is the same as our vision for our entire ministry, our podcast, everything we do. Our whole ministry is focused on one thing, that is illuminating biblical truth so that the people of God can know him more fully and love him more deeply. And I hope that as people who aren't Christian listen to our podcast and watch our videos and read our devotions and our articles, they also are inspired to think more deeply about who this Jesus guy is and what the gospel is. And is it possible that there is actually a God who's behind not just all of creation, but every single word of Scripture, a God who wants to know you, who wants to save you, who wants to be a father to you for the rest of time? So go to our website, thatyoumayknowhim.com, click to the blog, and check out all of the great content we have there. All right. Who is the great prostitute? Who is it? Who, all these symbols that we just talked about, all these attributes of the great prostitute, who does she represent in this book? I think there is a very clear and very obvious answer. And most New Testament scholars, at least the ones that I read, the good ones, agree with this. There's no doubt that for the people who first read this letter, the people to whom the book of Revelation was originally addressed, the 7 churches in Asia Minor, the 7 first century churches who lived within the Roman Empire, this great prostitute represents Rome. Not just the city, but the entire empire, plain and simple. Remember, I told you that the beast in chapter 13 sort of represents Rome, but more specifically, the Antichrist. And we see all these clues that key us into that fact. The great prostitute is not just Rome. It's not just only Rome, although it's specifically for the people who first read the book, it's Rome, yes, but it's also any secular power that deifies itself as the highest order over and against God. That's really what so much of the book of Revelation is about. A lot of these symbols, they overlap. The beast, the Antichrist, the dragon, the false prophet, the great prostitute. All these symbols, in all these symbols, we see a common thread. They represent secular power, and they are exalting themselves. And they are demanding that the peoples of the earth serve and worship them, not God and not the Lamb who saves us. Now, the harlot is unique because she's not so much demanding worship like the Antichrist, like the dragon, but she's wooing people. She's deceiving people and calling them in, just like the serpent did all the way back in the garden. She's using man and woman's fallen flesh, our sin-corrupted flesh, to lure us away from Christ, away from true salvation, true freedom, true blessing, eternal life, to get us to worship and serve her and those who she works for and works with. She's a deceiver more than anything else, and she's a temptress. Remember one thing. This is so important when you're studying the book of Revelation, and I've said it a lot, but I'll keep saying it. The biggest mistake that people make, the biggest error that they make when studying Revelation is trying to fit the symbols in this book into either the past or the future. They try and make the symbols be only past events or only future events. They try and jam the whole book, relegate the whole book into something for some people like preterists. All this stuff already happened. None of it has anything to do with us. So for a preterist who's reading this book, a preterist is someone who believes all Bible prophecy has already been fulfilled. They like when they hear me say the great harlot in Revelation 17 represents Rome, because in a sense, she does represent Rome without question. That's what the first Christians would have heard. It's what they would have understood. But you see, it doesn't end there. For the people who think that everything in the book of Revelation is only about the future, it only applies to the last 3.5 years of church history, and that's it. They hear me say that it's Rome and they go, no, it can't be Rome, right? None of this has happened yet. Here's the thing about Revelation. It speaks to all of church history. These symbols were very specific and had very real meaning to the people who first read the book. But that doesn't mean it stops there. There are people all through church history who could have looked at this symbol and looked at these attributes and thought that it applied directly to them. I'll give you one example. William Tyndale was a Bible translator, a Catholic priest who rebelled against the Roman Church and started translating Bibles into the vernacular in the 1400s. And he ended up being persecuted and martyred by the Roman Church. Let me quickly go back through some of these attributes, and you tell me whether you think that these would have qualified in William Tyndale's mind when thinking about the Roman Church that he once served, but then that he realized God was calling him out of it. Great prostitute, seated on many waters. So her influence is worldwide. It extends to almost every facet of the known world. The Roman Church in the 1400s had huge widespread influence, especially in Europe. The kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her. Well, the kings of the earth, the kings of Europe, all through that time period were more or less in bed with the bishops and the cardinals and the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church. There's tons of stories. And I'm not saying this to bag on the Roman Church, but there are tons of stories of popes and cardinals throughout church history that were so sexually deviant. It was unbelievable and so corrupt. She's clothed in very costly clothing, purple and scarlet. In the first century, this was the color not only of wealthy or expensive prostitutes, but also of kings and rulers, Roman officials, specifically the emperor. This is also the way rulers of the Catholic Church have dressed for years, in luxurious clothing. She's drunk with the blood of the saints and martyrs. The Roman Church killed many Christians as heretics who were not heretics. William Tyndale was not a heretic. His heresy consisted of believing that the Bible should be in the language of the people, not only in Latin to where only priests could read it. I think I've shared enough of that, but you see, these symbols can be applied all through church history. And there will be, I believe, a final iteration in the last 3.5 years before Christ returns. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So prophecy is not a formula, it is a pattern. That's the thing to remember always when studying biblical prophecy. It's not a formula, it's a pattern. We see things happen on repeat over and over again throughout the ages. There will be a final iteration in the end, just like there was a big, robust iteration right at the beginning of church history that sort of shows us and clues us in as to what it's going to be like in the end, and in some cases throughout church history. Rome was sort of like the template, and we'll see that come to pass. We'll see something very similar that fits the template come to pass again. Whew. All right. We have talked a lot about this great prostitute. We've talked a lot about the attributes that she's given in the Bible. We've talked about specifically who she represents, not only for the people who first read this book, the Christians living in Asia Minor, but also maybe what she'll look like in the very end, in the last days, and throughout what she's looked like throughout church history. Deified power that exalts itself over and against God. Could be secular, could also be religious. Now, there's one thing left we have to do, and that's quickly go through the timeline of events that chapters 17 and 18 cover. So we're going to just quickly run through all the things that happen leading up to chapter 19. And then our next episode, we'll dive into chapter 19. And we have finally made it to the return of the king, the rider on the white horse. But before we jump into the timeline real quickly. I just want to tell you that next week on our YouTube and Rumble channels, that you may know him, we're going to be releasing about a 10-minute video that covers a lot of what I just talked about, but very precise, specific, and quick in a systematic format. The video that we're working on right now currently is called The Great Prostitute, the Beast, and Mystery Babylon, Revelation 17 Made Easy. So look, if you ever get into conversations with people and they say, have you ever thought about the Great Harlot or Mystery Babylon or the Beast? Or do you know what any of these symbols represent? And maybe you don't want to send them to a 40-minute podcast episode. So you just say, hey, there's a 10-minute video on that. You may know him. Go check it out. That's what's coming up next week. It'll be released. I hope you can check it out when it comes out. Like I said, it'll be a lot more condensed than our episode here today. But if you're tuning in here, it's because you're into this, like I'm into this. Maybe you want to get deeper in the details because you're into the Bible like I'm into the Bible. All right. Here's our last segment of the day. The timeline of events. What is going to happen in Revelation chapters 17 and 18? What happens and what's going to happen in the end leading up to the return of Christ? But what happens in the last days? So first, we're introduced to the great prostitute riding on the beast and seated on many waters. She is described in detail, and we've covered that in detail. Then an angel from heaven announces this: fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons. Who's Babylon the Great? She's the great prostitute. That's who it is. The Roman Empire, or whatever iteration of the Roman Empire that will be on the earth, vying and demanding our worship and our devotion in the last days. She's become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And the kings of the earth, the rulers of the earth, have committed immorality with her. And the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. So that's what happens. We see her. We see the prostitute. An angel in heaven says, fallen is Babylon. She's about to be thrown down. Then the people of God are given a very important warning. Revelation 18:4. The same angel cries out, come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. What does this mean exactly? Well, it means that some of God's people have still been living in her, first and foremost. Now look, people that lived in Asia Minor in the first century couldn't do anything about it. There's lots of people who say, is America going to be the final iteration of the Roman Empire? Is America going to be the Mystery Babylon? If that's the case, there's some way, in some form or fashion, if you're born here and you live here and you've decided to follow Jesus, there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, what are you going to do? Like move to another country as if that's going to make anything better? That's not what coming out of her, my people, means. What coming out of her means is what John said, what the angel says it means. Do not take part in her sins. Do not take part in her sins. Now look, what sins have been described about this harlot? The first one is sexual immorality. That's a big one it's repeated over and over again in this chapter. The symbol is Rome, whatever the Mystery Babylon in the last days is represented is symbolized by a great harlot. So certainly sexual immorality is a part of this. Now look, I just want to touch on something for a minute. I don't think that currently America is in a position to qualify as being Mystery Babylon or the Great Harlot. We're still too much of a Christian nation, at least in some respect. I don't think that we are an inherently Christian nation. Don't hear me wrong, but there's still way too many people here, I believe, who fear and love God. And there's still too much resistance. There's too much ability for those people, myself included, to resist the government. What's being described here is a totalitarian regime, right? It's total authority. But just think about this for a minute, because we've talked about sexual immorality, luxurious living. The merchants of the earth have become rich on her luxurious living. Did you know that America is the #1 producer of pornography in the world today? A lot of people right now are talking about the sex trafficking problem that's going on in the world, and rightfully so. There was a movie that came out recently about this called Sound of Freedom. I haven't personally seen it yet. I tried to go with my wife. We couldn't get in. It was sold out, but I've been told on good, by a trustable source that it's worth seeing, especially if you're a Christian. You should go see it so you can know what's going on and pray for the people who are subjected to this demonic, horrible thing called sex trafficking. But there's no way to get around the fact that evil world is energized and fueled by the pornography business. I wrote a paper, I remember once in undergrad, that I had to research how the rise in pornography consumption directly related to the rise in sexual assaults in the United States. And America produces 60% of the pornography in the world, and we consume over 25% of it. Now, we produce way more than we consume because, of course, America, like in many industries, is on the cutting edge, and the people who are getting the most rich live in America. But isn't that crazy to think about? There are over 500 million pornographic pages, web pages on the internet right now today as I record this episode. And America's leading the charge. 60% of those are produced and hosted by American companies. 66% of those are in California, but that's a whole nother issue. That's one thing. But also, look, I'm not saying that it's wrong at all that America has prospered and that Americans, for most of our history, have prospered, right? We've been able to live with a higher standard of living than any people that have ever lived. There's nothing wrong with that. In many ways, you could say that's a blessing from God. But do we idolize that, you think? Do we as Americans, specifically American Christians, idolize that? And do we take part in things that are immoral because it's just like kind of the way it is? And even though we have all this stuff and all this luxury, and truly we have an easier life, the vast majority of people who live in 2023 in the West, in Western countries, I'm not saying everyone, but the vast majority of people who live in Western countries have easier lives than almost any people who have ever lived in the history of the world, period, end of story. Most people who have ever lived on planet Earth have spent most of their life and time and energy focused on one thing: getting what they need to survive, getting food, having shelter. And most people who have ever lived in the history of the world spend almost all day, every day working just to survive. We in America take so many things for granted. We not only have houses that are better and more luxurious than ever, and accessible food and clean water. We have internet, TVs, cell phones. I mean, we have amazingly easy lives. Some people might be saying, hey, my life's anything but easy, but think about it. I mean, if you decided to scale back, I know for a lot of people I know this is true. Maybe they say my life's not easy, but it could be easy. The opportunity for them to maybe scale back and just be content with having a home and one car and a family phone. Like, there's so much potential here, and there's so much comfort. There's so much ease compared to what most people in world history have experienced. I'm not saying that America's Mystery Babylon. I'm just saying there are connections. We have to guard ourselves against the sexual immorality that exists in our culture. It's not just on the internet now. It's creeped its way into cable TV, into the music we listen to, into advertisements. It's everywhere. And we have to guard ourselves against that. We have to guard ourselves against taking for granted the blessings that we have and actually taking God for granted and being lazy Christians who are content to just sit on the couch for 2 or 3 hours every night and watch TV that's doing nothing for them at the cost of what they could be doing for the kingdom of God, to help others, to know Jesus more fully and to serve him more faithfully and to love him more deeply. We have to guard against this stuff. We as Christians have to guard against the ways that we are being lured and called into taking part in the sins of our society and of our culture. That's what I think it means when the angel cries out, "Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins." We're told, this is the last bit, that her judgment is coming in a single day, in a single hour. The kings of the earth and the merchants who were enriched in her and by her will stand far off and watch her burn. They will weep and wail over her, even though they're the ones that deliver her over to destruction. This is the final judgment for Babylon. But here's the thing. Who destroys the great harlot in Revelation chapter 17 and 18? Who actually is empowered and enabled by God to bring about her destruction? This is going to blow your mind if you don't know the book. It's the beast himself. She has been propped up by the beast. So the beast is the Antichrist in Revelation, right? And the Antichrist comes forth via this world empire that props him up. But then we see that flip at the end of the book. The beast is propping up the empire. And what happens at the end is that the beast, the Antichrist, takes the harlot, Babylon, Rome, Mystery Babylon, and throws her down. And the kings of the earth, those who are working for and with the beast, who have been enriched by her, watch her burn and weep and wail over her. But this is how it's going to go. The great empire that has been calling us, trying to deceive and call us into worship it, be devoted to it, take part in its sins, is thrown down and replaced by a single person. And that single person is the one who will be defeated. And those who follow him, worship him, work for and with him, is the one that will be defeated by the rider on the white horse. So I think we've covered a lot. We know who the great prostitute in Revelation 17 and 18 is. We know how she ends, how her life, her reign comes to an end. She's actually devoured, thrown down by the beast himself, who more or less replaces her. And this is the last thing that happens before his judgment is coming, because his judgment is coming when the rider on the white horse appears, the one whose cloak is dipped in blood, whose name is the Word of God, and who has a sharp two-edged sword, which is the Word of God, coming out of his mouth. He's also the one we met all the way back in chapter 1. And that is what we're covering in our next episode of That You May Know Him, where we might just get all the way to the end of the book of Revelation. So y'all, thank you so much for being a part of this episode, for watching, for listening, whether you're catching us on YouTube, Rumble, or listening on iTunes, Spotify, Google Pods, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Of course, the best place to listen is directly on our website. Go to thatyoumayknowhim.com, click to the podcast player page. There's a link right on the front homepage right there. It's thatyoumayknowhim.com/listen. And you can listen to every one of our past episodes and browse through our series library. This series is about to come to an end. I'm happy about that. It's also bittersweet because it's been a lot of fun, but we're not there yet. We've still got a few more chapters to cover. And so we'll do that here in the next couple weeks. Until next time, I'm Blake Barbera signing off. Thank you so much for watching and listening to That You May Know Him. Stay blessed, live loved, and I will talk to you next time.